A badge, a lie, and a woman who wouldn't break. The towering columns of the city courthouse loomed against the morning sky, casting long, rigid shadows onto the marble steps. The air was thick with anticipation, mingling with the hum of whispered conversations and the occasional click of a journalist's camera. Inside the packed courtroom, wooden benches groaned under the weight of bodies pressed too tightly together, spectators eager to witness the unraveling of a case that had already gripped the nation. At the defendant's table sat Monica Jackson, her dark brown skin glowing faintly beneath the fluorescent lights. Her sharp, calculating eyes flicked across the room, scanning every face, every movement. To the casual observer, she appeared composed, her crisp navy blue blazer neatly fitted over a white blouse, her posture impeccable. But beneath that exterior, an old battle instinct simmered. She had faced enemies before, far worse than what awaited her in this courtroom. Across from her, seated at the plaintiff's table, Officer Bradley Simmons leaned back in his chair, his smirk barely concealed. Dressed in full police uniform, he exuded the arrogance of a man accustomed to unquestioned authority. His fingers drummed idly against the table, his expression one of amusement. He thought he had already won. Monica knew better. The bailiff's voice cut through the hushed murmurs. All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Howard Grayson presiding. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Judge Grayson strode in, his black robe flowing behind him. An older man with thinning silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he exuded an air of authority, though his face betrayed the weariness of years spent untangling legal disputes he wished would resolve themselves. As he took his seat, the courtroom settled into tense silence. State versus Monica Jackson, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Monica stood slowly, her movements deliberate, controlled. She met the judge's gaze without hesitation. The prosecution, represented by a seasoned district attorney named Richard Avery, rose from his chair. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his tailored suit a shade too pristine, as if he had dressed for a victory speech rather than a trial. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth and practiced. The prosecution is prepared to proceed. Judge Grayson gave a curt nod. Officer Simmons, please take the stand. The officer stood, adjusting his uniform as he made his way to the witness stand, pausing just briefly to glance at Monica. There it was again, that smirk. She studied him closely, watching the way his fingers fidgeted, the almost imperceptible shift in his weight as he sat down. He was confident, too confident. He swore his oath and leaned forward, his voice steady and loud. On the evening in question, Simmons began, I was responding to a disturbance call on the east side of town. I encountered the defendant, Miss Jackson, loitering outside a closed business. When I approached her and asked what she was doing, she became immediately hostile. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Monica's hands remained folded in her lap. Loitering. The word had been used against people who looked like her for decades. Simmons continued. She refused to identify herself and began raising her voice. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me. Gasps rippled through the room. She struck me in the chest and attempted to reach for my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her. From the back of the room, a voice muttered, Sounds like a lie. Heads turned, but the judge quickly called for order. Monica didn't react. She didn't need to. She could feel the tension shifting, subtle but unmistakable. The first crack in Simmons' carefully crafted story had formed. The judge turned to the defense table. Mr. Carter, your witness. Monica's lawyer, Benjamin Carter, was young. Too young, some said, to be handling a case of this magnitude. But Monica had chosen him for a reason. He was brilliant, methodical, and more importantly, unshakable when it mattered. He stood, adjusting his tie, and approached the stand. Officer Simmons, Benjamin began, his voice polite, but edged with something sharper. You've testified that my client struck you in the chest. Do you have medical records to confirm an injury? Simmons stiffened. I didn't require medical attention. No bruising. No. No report filed on the alleged assault. It was a chaotic situation. Simmons replied quickly. I was focused on handling the threat. Benjamin nodded. Ah, a threat. My client, who was unarmed, standing on a public sidewalk, checking her phone, was a threat to you. A trained police officer. Simmons shifted slightly in his chair. She refused to cooperate, he said, his tone harder now. She resisted. Benjamin tilted his head slightly. Resisted what, exactly? Asking a question. A murmur spread through the courtroom again. Judge Grayson banged his gavel. Benjamin took a slow step closer to the witness stand. Tell me, Officer Simmons, if my client truly reached for your weapon, why are there no fingerprints on your holster? No body camera footage confirming this claim. No dashcam footage. Simmons hesitated for just a second. It was enough. Benjamin smiled, the kind of smile that came just before a hammer dropped. You see, Officer Simmons, we have evidence of our own. The courtroom tensed. Monica exhaled softly, feeling the shift in power. Benjamin turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense intends to submit video footage from a bystander at the scene. Simmons' smirk vanished. Judge Grayson studied him for a moment before nodding. Proceed. Benjamin walked back to the defense table and retrieved a USB drive. The bailiff took it and inserted it into the courtroom's media system. The screen on the wall flickered to life. The footage was shaky, the angle imperfect, but the audio was crystal clear. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Simmons' voice rang out from the speakers. I'm not resisting. Monica's voice followed, calm but firm. Let go of my arm. The screen showed Simmons grabbing her wrist, forcefully yanking her toward him. And then, his words. Women like you don't get to question me. The room erupted. Simmons paled. The judge banged his gavel furiously. Order in the court. But it was too late. The truth was already out. Monica sat still, her expression unreadable. Inside, however, she knew this was only the beginning. She turned slightly to Benjamin and whispered, Now we watch the wall crumble. And from the look on Simmons' face, she could tell. It was already starting to crack. The cracks began to widen. The courtroom was a ticking bomb, and the explosion had just begun. As the damning footage played on the large courtroom screen, the room descended into chaos. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and spectators erupted into a mix of murmurs, gasps, and hushed debates. The very fabric of Officer Bradley Simmons' carefully woven lie had begun to unravel. But Monica Jackson, she remained still. She had seen the truth shake men before. She had seen liars lose their nerve when the weight of justice pressed down on them. And now, sitting in that defendant's chair, she was watching a predator turn into prey. Order. Judge Grayson banged his gavel, his normally composed expression cracking into a deep frown. I said order. The noise in the room died slowly, but it didn't disappear entirely. The energy was different now. Charged, dangerous. Everyone could see it. Simmons was rattled. His once smug smirk had been replaced by a clenched jaw and shifting eyes. His fingers twitched against the wooden table, and his knee bounced ever so slightly under the desk. A nervous tyke. For the first time since the trial began, Simmons knew he was in trouble. A smirking prosecutor and a silent officer. The moment the courtroom settled, the prosecutor, Richard Avery, shot to his feet. Your Honor, he snapped, his voice just slightly higher than usual, a sign of his own anxiety. This is highly irregular. The defense has just introduced video evidence without prior submission. This is a blatant attempt to blindside the prosecution. Judge Grayson lifted a hand, shutting him down immediately. Mr. Avery, I have been presiding over trials for 32 years. If you expect me to ignore the fact that we just heard an officer of the law utter an incredibly damning statement, then you are sorely mistaken. Avery paled, his lips pressing into a thin line. The judge turned to Benjamin Carter, Monica's lawyer. His expression was unreadable. "Mr. Carter," he said, tapping his fingers against the bench, "do you have anything to add before I make a ruling on this evidence?" Benjamin flashed a smile, but it wasn't a victorious one. It was a dangerous one. The kind of smile a soldier wears when they know the battle is already won. "Yes, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "The prosecution claims we are blindsiding them. But let's be clear. Officer Simmons had every opportunity to provide footage from his own body camera. He chose not to. The fact that we have to rely on a bystander's video is a testament to the corruption we're exposing today." A low ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. The judge nodded slowly, considering his words. Then, finally, he turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone heavy, "you will consider this video as admissible evidence." And just like that, the cracks in Simmons' case widened. A man begins to break. Benjamin wasted no time. The moment Judge Grayson ruled in their favor, he walked straight to the witness stand and faced Officer Simmons, who still sat there, his hands now visibly clenched into fists. "Officer Simmons," Benjamin started, tilting his head slightly, "I'd like you to explain something to me." Simmons' jaw tightened. "Go ahead." "The video footage we just saw." Benjamin took one slow step forward, locking eyes with the officer. "Was that your voice?" Simmons hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. But in a courtroom, a fraction of a second could mean the difference between guilt and innocence. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. A murmur spread through the crowd. "And in that footage," Benjamin continued, "we clearly hear you say the words, 'Women like you don't get to question me.' Did you say that?" Simmons swallowed. He knew he was backed into a corner. He started, then quickly adjusted his tie, as if stalling for time. "I don't recall the exact phrasing." Benjamin laughed softly, a slow, deliberate chuckle. "You don't recall?" he echoed. "Funny. It just happened to be caught on video, word for word. Want me to play it again?" Simmons' face turned red. "No need," he gritted out. Benjamin smiled. "Good. Now, tell me something, officer. If you truly believe my client was aggressive and violent, why would you say something like that?" "I was." Simmons licked his lips. "I was trying to de-escalate the situation." The courtroom erupted into laughter. Even Judge Grayson looked amused. Benjamin's smirk deepened. "Oh, I see. You de-escalate by throwing someone against a car, by grabbing them without cause." Simmons said nothing. He was losing, and he knew it. The defense's next move. Benjamin turned, facing the jury now. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward Simmons, "this is the man who claims my client is a danger to society. A man who can't even keep his own story straight. A man who was willing to lie under oath to send an innocent woman to jail." He turned back to Simmons, eyes glinting. "Tell me, Officer Simmons, how long have you been on the force?" 10 years. Benjamin nodded. "And in those 10 years, how many complaints have been filed against you?" The entire courtroom fell silent. Simmons froze. A flicker of panic passed through his eyes. The prosecutor, Richard Avery, shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked. "Irrelevant." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "I'd say it's very relevant, Mr. Avery." Overruled. Benjamin turned back to Simmons. "Well." Simmons' fingers twitched on the wooden stand. 9, he muttered. Benjamin leaned forward, feigning confusion. 9. 9 complaints of what, exactly? Simmons looked away. Benjamin's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Excessive force." Simmons said nothing. "Unlawful arrests." Still nothing. Benjamin straightened, turning to the jury once more. "This is not an officer acting in self-defense. This is an officer who saw a woman standing alone, and he decided he didn't like that. This is an officer who saw an opportunity to exert power, And when he was caught, he lied. The words rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. The jury was staring at Simmons now, their expressions hardening. The walls had begun to collapse around him. And Monica? She simply watched. This wasn't over. Not yet. When lies collapse, the truth stands tall. The air in the courtroom was different now. It wasn't just tense. It wasn't just charged. It was deadly. Like the silence before a storm. Monica Jackson sat at the defense table, her hands resting lightly against the wood, her fingers barely moving. Her posture was perfect, straight-backed, chin lifted, a warrior at rest. But her mind was honed in on one thing. Officer Bradley Simmons was unraveling. She had seen this before. Not in a courtroom, not in the safe walls of a building with rules and order, but on the battlefield, where cowards tried to lie their way out of responsibility, where men who thought they were untouchable discovered they weren't. And she could see it happening again. Simmons sat at the witness stand, his once pristine uniform now slightly wrinkled as he shifted in his seat. The sweat on his forehead was no longer just a sheen. It was a dripping weight. His hand was tapping against the wooden railing, twitching, ticking, panicking. The jury was watching him closely now, their eyes no longer filled with blind trust. They saw what Monica saw. They saw a man who had been caught in his own trap. Benjamin Carter, Monica's lawyer, took a step closer to the witness stand, his expression still calm, but there was an edge to his voice now, the kind of edge that cut deep. The final nail in Simmons' story. "Officer Simmons," Benjamin said smoothly, adjusting his tie like he had all the time in the world. "We were just discussing how you've had 9 complaints filed against you in your 10 years as an officer. Correct?" Simmons licked his lips, his hands clenching against the wood of the stand. Yes. His voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Right," Benjamin nodded. "And you also testified, under oath, that my client was aggressive with you." Simmons cleared his throat. "That's correct." Benjamin turned to the jury. 9 complaints, ladies and gentlemen. That's not a coincidence. He paced slightly, his steps measured, calculated. That's a pattern. He turned back to Simmons, eyes gleaming like a predator who already knew the kill was coming. "Now let's talk about that body camera of yours." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Simmons stiffened. "My body camera," he started. "Conveniently malfunctioned, correct?" Benjamin interrupted, lifting a single brow. Simmons hesitated. "Yes." Benjamin took another slow step forward. "Tell me, Officer Simmons, how often has your body camera malfunctioned in the past?" Simmons' jaw clenched. Benjamin waited. The courtroom waited. "Not often," Simmons admitted through gritted teeth. "Not often," Benjamin echoed. "And yet, on the exact night that you falsely accused my client, your camera conveniently stopped working." Simmons didn't answer. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence was louder than any excuse. The secret they didn't see coming. Benjamin turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp now, "the defense would like to introduce one more piece of evidence." Simmons' head snapped up. A flicker of fear crossed his face. Richard Avery, the prosecutor, immediately stood up, his face pale. "Your Honor, the defense is stalling." Judge Grayson held up a hand, cutting him off. "Sit down, Mr. Avery." Avery's jaw tightened, but he obeyed. Benjamin walked back to the defense table and picked up a single piece of paper. Just one. Then he turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, holding up the document, "we've heard Officer Simmons' version of events. We've heard my client's. We've even seen video evidence. But now, I want to show you something Officer Simmons never expected us to find." The room went completely still. The tension was thick. Benjamin walked to the judge's bench and handed him the paper. Judge Grayson took one look at it, and his eyebrows shot up. He exhaled deeply, rubbing his temple before nodding. "Proceed," he said, handing the paper back. Benjamin turned back to Simmons, his smile slow and deliberate. "Officer Simmons," he said softly, but his voice carried through the entire room. "Would you like to tell the court about the formal complaint that was filed against you just 6 months ago?" The entire courtroom shifted. People leaned forward. Simmons' face drained of all color. "What?" he rasped. Benjamin turned to the jury. "This," he said, holding up the paper, "is an official record from Internal Affairs. It details a formal complaint filed against Officer Simmons by another black woman, one who accused him of excessive force." Judge Grayson's face darkened. The jury's expressions changed completely. Simmons looked like he had been punched in the gut. Benjamin stepped closer to the witness stand. "Would you care to explain that, officer?" Simmons opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no words, no excuses, no way out. A lie exposed. The courtroom exploded. Gasps. Journalists whispering into their recorders. Even some of Simmons' own fellow officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Because now it was clear. This wasn't just about Monica Jackson. This was a pattern. Simmons had done this before. And this time, he had finally picked the wrong woman. Judge Grayson banged his gavel violently. "Order, order in the court." The noise slowly died down. Monica, still calm, still watching, exhaled slowly. It was over. Not officially. Not yet. But Officer Simmons was finished. The jury wasn't just looking at him anymore. They were glaring. Benjamin adjusted his tie and turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe we have everything we need. The defense rests." The courtroom was silent. Monica sat back, watching Simmons break, watching the walls fall down. And in that moment, she knew. Justice wasn't just possible. It was inevitable. The truth becomes a weapon. The moment Benjamin Carter declared, "The defense rests," the air in the courtroom shifted. It was a moment that would be talked about for years. Somewhere in the back row, a woman let out a quiet gasp. A journalist's pen snapped against paper. And Officer Bradley Simmons. He sat frozen, his jaw locked, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. But his eyes, oh, his eyes. For the first time since this trial began, they weren't filled with arrogance. For the first time, he wasn't smirking or leaning back like he had already won. He was trapped, and he knew it. A courtroom in chaos. Judge Grayson sat in stunned silence, his gaze flicking between Benjamin Carter and the official Internal Affairs complaint that had just destroyed the prosecution's case. The jury members shifted in their seats. Some of them exchanged long, knowing looks, the kind that told Monica exactly what she needed to know. They had already made up their minds. "Your Honor," the prosecutor, Richard Avery, scrambled to his feet, his voice tight with frustration. "I request a recess before moving forward." Benjamin tilted his head. "You need a recess?" he asked, almost amused. Avery's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," he said stiffly. "The prosecution needs time to do what?" Benjamin interrupted, his voice now sharper. "To find a way to explain how your key witness just got caught in a massive lie." Avery scowled. But before he could speak, Judge Grayson raised a hand. "The court will recess for 1 hour," he announced, his tone giving no room for argument. He banged the gavel once. Court dismissed. The hallway showdown. The second Monica stepped out of the courtroom doors, the hallway exploded into chaos. Journalists swarmed. Camera crews lunged forward, microphones thrust in her direction. "Miss Jackson," a female reporter called, shoving a recorder toward her. "How do you feel about what just happened?" Another voice cut through the crowd. "Did you expect this case to turn against Officer Simmons? What do you think will happen next?" Benjamin stepped in front of her, holding up a hand. No comments until after the trial. But Monica. She stopped walking. She turned slowly, meeting the swarm of reporters head-on. And in one clear, steady voice, she said, "The truth always wins." Then she walked away, and nobody could argue with her. Simmons loses control. Back inside the courthouse, Bradley Simmons stood in the hallway, his hands shaking. His lawyer, a stiff-looking man in a gray suit, was whispering furiously in his ear. "You need to get ahead of this," the lawyer hissed. "Deny the accusations. Say the complaint was handled internally." But Simmons wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on Monica Jackson, who stood a few feet away, speaking in low, calm tones with Benjamin. Something about that calm sent rage crawling up his spine. She wasn't afraid of him. Not like the others had been. Not like the last woman who had filed a complaint, who had eventually dropped the charges after too much pressure from his department. But Monica, she was different, and that scared the hell out of him. "Hey," he snapped, stepping forward. Benjamin turned first, eyes narrowing. Monica followed, unimpressed. "I suggest you watch your tone," Benjamin warned, stepping in front of her again. But Monica, she moved past him. She walked straight up to Simmons and stood toe to toe with him. And she didn't blink. "You don't scare me, officer." Her words were quiet, controlled, but they hit him like a bullet. Simmons' face twisted. "You think you've won," he snarled under his breath. Monica smiled, just a little. "I don't think. I know." His hands curled into fists. But then, "Officer Simmons," a voice cut through the hallway. A court security guard approached, his stance rigid, his expression unreadable. "The judge has requested you in his chambers." Simmons stiffened. Monica watched as his confidence shattered just a little more. And when he turned and stormed away, she exhaled slowly. Benjamin let out a low chuckle. "That man's going to crack before the trial's even over." Monica's eyes stayed fixed on where Simmons had disappeared. "He already has." Back in the courtroom, when court resumed an hour later, the mood had changed. Simmons was no longer the center of power. He was the accused, even though he wasn't the one officially on trial. His own department had distanced itself from him. And the jury? They were done with him. Judge Grayson sighed heavily as he looked at both attorneys. "We're moving to closing arguments," he announced. "Let's finish this." Avery, the prosecutor, looked like a man walking to his execution as he rose to speak. His voice lacked the fire from before. He spoke for only 5 minutes. And when he sat down, he knew he had already lost. Then Benjamin stood, and he didn't waste time. He didn't drag his argument. He turned to the jury, his voice steady, unwavering. "You've seen the evidence." He gestured toward Simmons. "You've seen a liar caught in his own lies." He turned back to Monica. "And you've seen a woman who refused to let him get away with it." A pause. Then, "This trial isn't just about Monica Jackson. This trial is about accountability. And now it's in your hands." He sat, and the courtroom held its breath. Verdict. The moment that changed everything. The jury was gone for less than an hour. That was all the time they needed. When they returned, the courtroom fell into silence. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but a firm expression, stood and read the verdict. In the case of State versus Monica Jackson, a heartbeat, a second, a moment that felt endless. We find the defendant, not guilty. The room erupted. Gasps, cheers. Journalists scrambled to break the story. Simmons slumped in his seat, his face hollow. Judge Grayson banged his gavel for order. But there was no stopping it. Monica exhaled slowly. Benjamin grinned, whispering, "We did it." Monica turned her head, locking eyes with Simmons one last time. Then she stood and walked out a free woman. But Simmons? His fight had just begun. The reckoning of Officer Simmons. One verdict, 2 battles. The moment the words "not guilty" were read aloud, Monica Jackson felt the weight of the trial lift off her shoulders. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Not for Simmons. As the jury members stood to leave, some of them shot lingering glances at the disgraced officer. Even Judge Grayson, who had remained impartial throughout the trial, stared at Simmons with an expression that wasn't quite neutral anymore. In the back row of the courtroom, several uniformed police officers exchanged glances. They had supported Simmons when this trial began. They had filled those seats as a show of unity. But now they weren't looking at him the same way. Some of them had already started to distance themselves. And Simmons felt it. He sat at the plaintiff's table, frozen, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of the table. His breathing was shallow, erratic. His entire career had depended on one thing: his ability to get away with whatever he wanted. And now, sitting in front of the entire world, he had just lost that power. For the first time, he was the one being watched. For the first time, he was the one being judged. Outside the courtroom, the eye of the storm. As soon as Monica stepped into the hallway, the chaos erupted again. Cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. Microphones were thrust in her face. Monica, how does it feel to win this case? What do you have to say about Officer Simmons? Do you believe justice was served? But Monica wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. Not when Simmons' reckoning was just beginning. She glanced at Benjamin Carter, who nodded subtly and stepped forward. The defense will release an official statement later, Benjamin announced, his voice cutting through the noise. Miss Jackson has nothing more to say at this time. But before Monica could walk away, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. Monica. She turned, and standing there, against the wall, away from the chaos, was a woman she hadn't seen in over a decade. Captain Elaine Foster, a former SEAL team leader, her mentor, her commander, the only officer Monica had ever trusted with her life. She stood tall, her short silver-streaked hair still cropped close to her head, her dark green eyes sharp as ever, and on her navy blue suit jacket, a single insignia glinted under the fluorescent lights, a government insignia. Monica's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a reunion. This was something else. Something bigger. Elaine lifted her chin slightly. We need to talk. Simmons faces the fire. Inside the courtroom, Officer Simmons hadn't moved, even as the jury filed out. Even as Judge Grayson gathered his things and left. Even as the police officers in the back row stood one by one, not bothering to speak to him. Then, one voice, Bradley. Simmons turned, and standing behind him was Deputy Chief Alan Carter, one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. His face was blank, but his eyes, they weren't. Come with me. Simmons swallowed hard. Sir. Now. His voice was like a blade, sharp, precise, cutting through any excuse before Simmons could even make one. Simmons stood, and as he walked through that courtroom, past the spectators, past the emptying seats, he realized something. The same people who had once treated him like an untouchable officer were now looking at him like a liability, like a man who had finally gone too far. And for the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar. Fear. The meeting that changed everything. Elaine Foster led Monica down a quiet hallway, away from the cameras, away from the reporters, away from everyone. They entered a small conference room, and as soon as the door clicked shut, Monica crossed her arms. What are you doing here, Captain? Elaine gave a small smirk. You still call me Captain, she mused. Monica didn't blink. Elaine sighed, running a hand through her hair. I watched the trial, she admitted. All of it. And when I saw you walk into that courtroom, I knew you were going to take him apart. Monica studied her carefully. But you didn't come here to congratulate me. Elaine's expression hardened. No. She stepped closer. Simmons isn't just a bad cop. He's connected. Monica's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Elaine reached into her suit jacket and pulled out a thin file. She handed it over. Monica opened it, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The secrets inside the file. There, in black and white photographs, were surveillance images of Simmons, meeting with men in suits, exchanging envelopes, standing outside buildings that had no official addresses. Monica flipped through the pages, her pulse pounding. Then she reached the last document, a sealed report from Internal Affairs, a report that had been buried. And there, in bold, were the words, Officer Bradley Simmons, under investigation for corruption and racketeering. Monica looked up slowly. Elaine's eyes met hers. This case was never just about you, Monica. Simmons isn't just a liar. He's dirty. She leaned forward. And the people protecting him. They don't want him to fall alone. Monica closed the file, took a deep breath, and for the first time since walking out of that courtroom, she realized the war wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. The war behind the badge. Buried truths and new battlefields. Monica Jackson stared at the file in her hands. It was thicker than she expected. Pages filled with internal reports, photos, lists of names, some of which she recognized, some of which she didn't. But one thing was clear. Officer Bradley Simmons wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a pawn in something bigger. And someone powerful had been covering for him, for a long time. She lifted her gaze to Elaine Foster, her old SEAL commander, now standing across the room with her arms crossed. Monica's voice was quiet, but it carried a deadly weight. How long have you known about this? Elaine sighed. Long enough. She gestured to the file. This is just the surface. The real rot runs deeper. Monica closed the folder, her fingers pressing into the cover. You knew this, she said, her tone turning sharp, and you let me walk into that courtroom blind. Elaine met her gaze, unflinching. I needed to see what you would do, she admitted. I needed to see if you would break him without even knowing the whole game. A slow, dangerous realization settled in Monica's chest. This trial, she murmured, it wasn't just about me. Elaine nodded. No, she said simply. It wasn't. Meanwhile, Simmons gets a visit, while Monica and Elaine sat in a private conference room. Across the courthouse, Officer Bradley Simmons sat in his own kind of prison. The deputy chief had led him into a secluded office, a single light buzzing above a wooden desk. And now, as Simmons sat in a stiff-backed chair, his hands clenched into fists on his lap, the reality was hitting him all at once. His department wasn't protecting him anymore. The same system that had once shut down complaints against him was now turning its back. And then, the door opened. Two men walked in, both in dark suits. No badges, but they didn't need any. Simmons immediately recognized them, and that recognition sent a wave of nausea rolling through his stomach. Officer Simmons, the taller of the two men, said, closing the door behind him. Simmons sat up straighter. He had seen these men before. Not in official meetings, not in police precincts, but in the back rooms of bars, in private buildings with no security cameras. These men weren't police officers. They were the ones who bought police officers, and they were looking at him like a problem. The shorter man leaned forward. You had one job, Bradley. Simmons swallowed hard. The taller man cut him off. You were supposed to take care of a problem. Instead, you became one. His heart pounded. Wait, Simmons started. I can fix this. The shorter man raised an eyebrow. Can you? Simmons nodded quickly. Yes. The trial. They think they won. But they don't know the whole story. They don't know who's really pulling the strings. If we move fast, we can still control the narrative. The taller man sighed. He reached into his coat pocket. Simmons flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, the man pulled out a small phone, tapped the screen, turned it around. And Simmons' stomach dropped, because there on the screen was the video of his arrest. The same footage that had played in court, the same footage that had ruined him. Except now, it was everywhere. Thousands of retweets, News anchors discussing it, his name trending, his face plastered across every news cycle in the country. He was done. The shorter man smirked. "You're not useful to us anymore, Bradley." Simmons' breath came fast, panicked. "You can't do this," he hissed. You need me." The taller man shook his head. "No, we don't." Then, before Simmons could react, the taller man reached forward, grabbed Simmons by the collar of his uniform, and yanked him forward. Simmons' head snapped to the side, his face colliding against the desk with a sickening thud. Pain exploded through his skull. Before he could get his bearings, the shorter man leaned down, his voice a whisper. "If you're smart, you'll disappear," he murmured. "Otherwise, the next hit won't be a warning." And with that, they turned and walked out, leaving Simmons bleeding onto the desk. Back to Monica. The real war begins. Monica closed the file and exhaled slowly. "This is bigger than one dirty cop," she said. Elaine nodded. "This is a network." Monica frowned, flipping through the pages again. "Who's at the top?" she asked. Elaine hesitated. Then she spoke one name, and Monica's entire body went still. She recognized that name, not from the news, not from political circles, but from the classified mission reports she had read back when she was still active duty military. From the shadowy figures who had played both sides of wars and conflicts. From the intelligence briefings that had warned about high-level corruption in government and law enforcement. Monica's fingers tightened around the folder. This wasn't just a cover-up. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a powerful machine, and Simmons had only been a disposable cog. Elaine watched her carefully. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Monica looked up. Her dark eyes were calm. "Deadly. I want to finish this." Elaine's lips twitched into a smirk. "I thought you might say that." She slid a second folder across the table. Monica opened it. Inside, more names, more connections, and one specific address. Monica's pulse quickened. It was time to stop reacting. It was time to strike first. She had fought wars overseas. She had fought for her country, for justice, for honor. Now she was fighting for something even bigger, and she wasn't going in alone. She looked up at Elaine. "Tell me what I need to know." Elaine grinned. "Welcome to the real war, Commander. The fall of a corrupt empire. When a soldier goes to war, she finishes it." Monica Jackson had spent 20 years serving her country. She had fought in hostile territories. She had neutralized threats in places the world would never hear about. She had been a ghost, a warrior, a commander. And now, she was about to go to war again. Only this time, the enemy wasn't on foreign soil. It was right here, in her own backyard. The mission begins. The address Elaine Foster had given her wasn't a government building. It wasn't a police precinct. It was a private estate, deep in the countryside, hidden away behind gates and security cameras. A place where men in power met to make decisions that never reached the public. A place where corruption was born. And tonight, Monica was going in. She sat inside a black SUV, parked in the darkness, her gloved fingers gripping the steering wheel as she surveyed the estate through a pair of high-tech binoculars. From her position, she could see at least 6 security guards, armed, moving in tight formations. More inside. More cameras. She'd infiltrated enemy compounds before, but this was different. Because this time, she wasn't alone. Elaine's voice crackled through the earpiece in Monica's ear. "You ready for this, Commander?" Monica smirked. "Always." She slipped out of the vehicle, moving like a shadow, her boots making no sound as she crossed the open field leading up to the estate. She wasn't wearing a police uniform. She wasn't wearing a military uniform. Tonight, she was just Monica, and she was about to bring the whole empire down. Inside the lion's den. Inside the estate's luxurious meeting room, a small group of powerful men sat in high-backed leather chairs, swirling expensive whiskey in crystal glasses. At the head of the table sat one man, a man Monica had spent years hunting without knowing it. Nathaniel Greer, a billionaire with deep ties to law enforcement, politics, and private defense contracts. A man who didn't appear in newspapers, who never left digital fingerprints, who never needed to get his hands dirty, because he had men like Simmons to do it for him. He was the real problem. And tonight, he was the target. Greer leaned back in his chair, watching a screen mounted on the wall. The screen was playing the news. A reporter was talking about Monica's case, about Simmons' lies, about the police department scrambling to contain the fallout. Greer swirled his drink. "This is a mess," he muttered. "Simmons was supposed to handle this." One of the other men, a former senator, scoffed. "Simmons was a blunt instrument," he said. "You should have let him go years ago." Greer frowned. "That's not the point," he said. "The point is, we've lost control of the story." The men nodded. Then, a noise. A small, almost imperceptible creak near the doorway. Greer's eyes narrowed. "Did you hear?" The lights cut out. Everything went black. And in that perfect moment of darkness, a figure moved. Monica strikes. By the time the emergency lights flickered back on, 2 of Greer's bodyguards were already down. A third one reached for his gun. But Monica was faster. She moved like a storm, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat, her fist slamming into his throat, cutting off his air. He collapsed, choking. The remaining men scrambled, panic setting in. Then, a new sound filled the room. A voice. Low, calm, deadly. "Sit down, gentlemen." Greer turned, his face going pale as Monica stepped forward, silent, controlled, a force of nature. She wasn't angry. She wasn't reckless. She was focused. And that was much, much worse. Greer's hand inched toward his phone. Monica tilted her head. "I wouldn't." He froze. The room was dead silent. Then, from the doorway, Elaine stepped in. She held up a small device, a tiny USB drive. She smiled. "Guess what we found, boys?" She tossed the drive onto the table. Monica smirked. Everything. The final blow. For years, these men had operated without fear. They had bought silence. They had buried evidence. They had used people like Simmons as disposable pawns. But now the tide had turned. Elaine gestured toward the USB drive. This is a gift from your own files." She tapped the side of her head. "You really should have kept better cybersecurity." Greer's eyes darkened. "What's on it?" he asked, his voice tight. Elaine leaned forward. "Names, bank transfers, bribes, deals, every dirty secret you thought was erased. It wasn't. And now, it's ours." She smiled. "And the best part, the feds already have a copy." Greer's jaw clenched. The men around him shifted, some of them breaking into cold sweats. Monica leaned down, planting her hands on the table. Her voice was low, controlled. "This is over." Greer's breathing quickened. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. Monica held his gaze. "No, Nathaniel. You have no idea who you pissed off." She turned, walked toward the door, paused, then glanced back, her expression calm. "Final. See you in court." Epilogue. The house falls. The arrests came fast. The news cycle exploded. Nathaniel Greer, once untouchable, was dragged from his mansion in handcuffs. More names came out. More secrets. More corruption exposed. Officer Bradley Simmons. He tried to run. He didn't get far. They found him in a hotel in Mexico, trying to escape before the full weight of his actions caught up with him. He was extradited. And this time, there was no escape. As for Monica, she stood outside the courthouse, the wind cool against her skin, watching as the pieces finally fell into place. Elaine stood beside her. You did it, Commander. Monica exhaled. No, we did. Elaine chuckled. What now? Monica thought about it, then smirked. I think, she said, I'm finally going home. And with that, she walked away. A soldier, a warrior, and finally, a woman free of battle.